She told the CEO I seduced him, but he played the recording where she begged me to. It started with a whisper in the hallway, a rumor so sharp and quick it cut through the office silence like a knife. I was sitting at my desk when the assistant, her voice dripping with fake concern, slid the accusation across the table. "Everyone's talking," she said, eyes narrowed, "that you seduced the CEO." I laughed it off, at first, but the smile didn't last, because 2 hours later, I was called into the CEO's office. His face was unreadable, but his eyes held something colder than disappointment. "Is this true?" he asked. I shook my head. No, but the seed had been planted. By the end of the day, the gossip had turned into a cold war. I was the enemy. The office became a maze of suspicious glances and whispered conversations. No one wanted to be near the seductress. I kept my head down, my hand steady, but inside, everything was trembling. The woman who started it, my rival, was smirking like she had already won, until the CEO called a meeting. Everyone was there, expecting drama. Instead, he played a recording. Her voice, not mine, begging me, planning. The room went silent. I looked up, eyes meeting his. "I never lied," I said, "and now neither will she." The recording was like a hurricane ripping through the calm facade the office had put up. Everyone listened in stunned silence as her voice spilled from the speaker, a mixture of desperation and cunning. She wasn't just accusing me, she was orchestrating a trap. I remembered the countless meetings where she smiled sweetly but whispered poison behind closed doors. The CEO's face shifted from confusion to disbelief to anger. "Why didn't you tell me this sooner?" he asked me afterward. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding. "I tried," I said, "but no one believed me," and she made sure to cover her tracks well. The meeting ended, but the storm was just beginning. I was still the office pariah, but now I had proof. The CEO didn't speak about the recording publicly, but his attitude toward me changed. He gave me the tasks others refused, defended my reputation quietly, and started including me in strategic meetings again. Yet the rival wasn't done. She ramped up the sabotage, leaving forged emails on my desk, spreading rumors of incompetence. I had to keep my guard up, but the recording gave me something she never could: truth. And with truth, I found a new strength. I started documenting everything, every interaction, every suspicious email, every whispered threat. I wasn't just fighting to clear my name, I was preparing for a reckoning, because the moment the recording played, the game changed, and I was ready to play. Days passed, and the atmosphere shifted palpably. The CEO, once distant, became a quiet ally, his respect growing in subtle ways. He began to consult me directly, asking for my insights on upcoming projects and inviting me to leadership meetings. The rival, sensing her hold slipping, grew desperate. She started targeting my work with petty criticisms, questioning my decisions in front of colleagues, and subtly undermining my contributions. But I refused to back down. I kept compiling evidence, emails, notes, witness statements, each piece carefully organized. I confided in a trusted mentor who encouraged me to prepare for a formal complaint. The office whispered about the inevitable showdown, but I stayed focused. One afternoon, the rival called me into a conference room, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "You should watch your back," she said. "Not everyone is on your side." I looked her in the eye and smiled, confident for the first time in months. "Actually, I'm stronger than you think." The CEO's recording had not only saved me, but had ignited a fire I never knew I had. I was no longer a victim of office politics. I was a force. And soon, the truth would not just be heard, it would be impossible to ignore. The day the complaint was filed, the office buzzed with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Rumors swirled, alliances shifted, and eyes watched every move. I felt the weight of every gaze, but held my head high. The HR department took the allegations seriously, opening an internal investigation. The rival tried to maintain her facade of innocence, but cracks began to show. I was called to give a formal statement, recounting every manipulation, every lie, every attempt to ruin my reputation. The CEO stood by silently, his presence a quiet reassurance. The investigation wasn't easy. There were moments I doubted myself, moments I feared retaliation. But I kept reminding myself why I fought, not just for me, but for every woman who had been silenced in those hallways. Weeks later, the report came back. The rival's actions were deemed unprofessional and malicious. She was reprimanded and removed from several projects. It wasn't a complete victory, but it was a start. The CEO finally addressed the team, praising my resilience and commitment. His words weren't loud or flashy, but they spoke volumes. "Truth has a way of finding its way," he said, "and it deserves to be heard." That day, I realized the power of standing up, even when the odds seemed stacked against you. The office began to shift. Respect replaced suspicion. And for the first time in a long time, I felt seen. With the investigation behind us, the days slowly returned to a fragile normal. The rival kept her distance, and while the atmosphere remained tense, I was no longer an outcast. The CEO's support became more apparent. He entrusted me with higher-profile assignments and valued my input during strategic planning. One afternoon, during a company retreat, we found ourselves alone on the terrace overlooking the city skyline. He turned to me, eyes serious yet softened. "I should have seen what was happening sooner," he admitted. "You didn't deserve any of it." I nodded, feeling a mix of relief and lingering hurt. "Thank you," I said quietly. "But I'm not just here because of what happened. I'm here because I believe in the company and in what we can build together." That moment marked a turning point, not just professionally, but personally. I realized that strength isn't about never falling. It's about standing up again and again, no matter the odds. The CEO and I forged a new understanding, one built on transparency and respect. And as the retreat ended, I felt something I hadn't in a long time. Hope. Not just for my career, but for myself. The months that followed were a mix of challenge and growth. I worked harder than ever, determined to prove my worth beyond any accusation or rumor. The rival, now sidelined, faded into the background, her power diminished. The CEO continued to show his support, not just through words, but through actions. He advocated for me in meetings, recommended me for promotions, and made sure my voice was heard. One evening, after a long day, he invited me to a quiet dinner at a small restaurant away from the office buzz. Over shared plates and soft lighting, he said, "You were right to stand your ground." It made me see things differently. I smiled, grateful but guarded. Trust wasn't given freely anymore, it had to be earned. But for the first time, I felt like more than just an employee. I felt like a partner in something meaningful. The recording had been the catalyst, but it was our resilience that built the bridge. And as I looked around the room, I realized that sometimes the hardest battles lead to the strongest foundations. Kai showed up every day after that, not with grand gestures or apologies, but quietly and consistently. He would sit beside the crib, watching our son sleep, occasionally asking simple questions about feeding schedules, sleep patterns, or whether I had chosen a pediatrician. At first, I answered cautiously, unsure of his intentions, but he never pushed, never demanded. One afternoon, while filling out insurance paperwork, he looked up and asked, "Do you remember Singapore?" The memory hit me like a wave. It was the night we first let down our guards, the night he looked at me like I wasn't just a name on his schedule. We walked the city streets, talked about books and childhood, shared moments that felt real amid the chaos. That night ended with a kiss, tender and fleeting, but by morning he was back to emails and meetings. "I thought it was just a moment," he said now, staring at our son. "I convinced myself it meant more to you than it did to me, that it was safer to let you go than let it grow into something real." I didn't respond, not because I had nothing to say, but because I had already said it in silence and survival in naming our child after him. "I was wrong," he added quietly, "about everything." Then he looked at me with something new, a vulnerability I had never seen before. I want to know him. Not just because I'm his father, but because he's mine. My heart didn't soften, not yet, but something shifted. For the first time, I believed him. And for the first time, he sounded like someone who understood the difference between ownership and responsibility. The day we were discharged, he offered to drive us home. I hesitated, but accepted, knowing the weight of navigating the cold streets with a newborn in bags was heavier than my pride. The ride was quiet, no music, just the hum of the engine and the soft breathing of my son in the back seat. At a red light, he broke the silence. "I told the board I made a mistake," he said quietly. I glanced at him, surprised. "You admitted it." He nodded. "They weren't happy, but I'm not letting them pretend you were the problem." I turned my gaze back to the window, swallowing hard. "I don't care about the board." "I know," he said gently. He parked outside the building I was staying at and helped carry the bags upstairs, awkwardly holding the diaper bag as if it might break. At the door, he paused. "Do you need anything?" I shook my head. "We'll be okay." "I know, but I still want to help." I didn't let him in, not yet, but I saw the change in his face when I closed the door gently without slamming. Inside, I set my son down and sat beside him, heart pounding, not from fear, but from something slower, something like hope. Not for us, not yet, but for the man who once erased me learning how to see clearly. And for me, finally done, shrinking to fit someone else's silence. Over the following weeks, he kept showing up, not always physically at my door, but in ways that mattered. He quietly set up a trust fund for our son without any public announcement, sent a letter to HR retracting their claims about my lack of transparency, and even offered to reinstate me at the company with my previous salary and flexible remote options. I declined, not out of bitterness, but because I was no longer going backward. I was moving forward, building something new on my own terms. Despite this, he remained present. One afternoon, he waited outside the clinic just to walk us home after checkup. Another day, he spent hours assembling a stroller he had researched himself, fumbling through instructions like a novice. It wasn't romantic or perfect. It was awkward, honest, and human. And that was the surprise. I didn't need grand gestures or apologies. I just needed consistency. He started calling our son Kai Jr. and nervously joked about the future embarrassment. "He'll hate that name someday," he laughed. "Then he'll know who to blame," I teased back. We weren't healed, nor were we a family again, but we were trying. One night, after putting the baby to sleep, he lingered at the doorway and quietly asked, "Can I be part of his firsts?" First words, first steps, first heartbreak. I looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. If you keep showing up, not as the CEO or the man who vanished, but as the father he deserves, then yes. And as he walked away that night, I realized maybe this wasn't the end but the beginning. Unexpected but necessary. I didn't tell many people who the father was, not out of shame, but because I didn't know anyone that part of my story anymore. Gossip had a way of slipping through office walls, and I refused to be a cautionary tale whispered behind closed doors. Still, the truth found its own rhythm. A former colleague messaged me one afternoon. "Is it true? He's the father." I didn't reply. What mattered wasn't what strangers thought, but what my son would one day know. Yet silence was short-lived. A tech blog published an article about my termination and the CEO's quiet attempts to make amends. No names were mentioned, but the details were unmistakable. The article went viral. Suddenly, I was the woman who named her baby after the CEO who fired her. Headlines spun the story. Some called it poetic justice, others manipulation. I stayed out of it. I focused on feeding my son, rocking him to sleep, singing off-key lullabies in the quiet hours. Kai called the morning after the story broke. "I didn't leak it," he said immediately. "I believe you," I replied. He hesitated, then asked, "Do you regret naming him after me?" I looked at my son, wrapped in a blanket, half asleep. "No, I regret trusting the wrong version of you, but I don't regret giving him a name born from truth." He didn't respond, just exhaled, a breath that felt like understanding. For once, there was nothing to spin, only raw, inconvenient truth. In the weeks that followed, people treated me differently. Some admired me quietly. Others kept a cautious distance, as if I were a living headline waiting to explode. But I kept my head down, folding laundry, taking pictures of Kai Jr. learning to smile with sleepy eyes. One morning, a package arrived at my door, no return address. Inside was a simple frame with a printout of the calendar from the day I was fired. The date was circled in red, with a handwritten note in Kai's handwriting beneath. The worst decision of my career, the beginning of everything that matters. I didn't cry or frame it. I tucked it away beside the baby's hospital bracelet and my old company badge. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was acknowledgement, a small sign that he was trying to learn from what he broke. That night, we shared takeout on the floor while Kai Jr. napped in his carrier. We laughed over spilled sauce and cold noodles. It felt strange and safe human. At one point, he asked, "Do you miss the life you had before all this?" I looked at him carefully and said no, because I didn't have a life, I had a role. He nodded slowly, and now. I glanced at my son, fingers curling around mine, even in sleep. Now I have something real, and I'm not letting anyone rewrite that ever again. One evening, as I rocked Kai Jr. to sleep, I found myself whispering stories to him. Not fairy tales, but truths about strength, silence, and starting over. I told him how I once sat in a boardroom, unseen and unheard, until I chose to walk away. How he was born on a rainy Wednesday with no flowers or cameras. Just a mother who refused to let the world define his beginning by my ending. I didn't know if he'd ever understand the weight of his name, but I wanted him to grow up knowing that names are more than labels. They're choices, markers of history, sometimes even redemption. The next day, Kai stopped by unannounced, carrying a box of books, parenting manuals, bedtime stories, and a thin notebook filled with notes he had taken during every visit. Observations, questions, things to remember. On the first page, he'd written, "I can't undo what I erased, but I can learn to be present for what's still unfolding." For the first time, I believed he was becoming more than a man trying to fix a mistake. He was learning how to show up, imperfectly, without applause. He didn't ask for another chance with me, and I didn't offer one. But we sat on the floor with our son between us, reading aloud, laughing at our mistakes. In that quiet moment, I realized we weren't rewriting the past. We were building a new chapter. One where my voice wasn't silenced, where my child wasn't hidden, and where the man who once fired me was learning to father the very person who carried his name. Months passed, and life settled into a new rhythm. Kai Jr. grew stronger each day, his laughter filling the apartment like warm sunlight breaking through clouds. I watched him learn to crawl, then walk, each milestone a quiet victory. Kai and I kept a cautious distance, communicating mostly through shared care routines and occasional texts about appointments or supplies. One evening, as Kai held our son for the first time without hesitation, he looked at me with softened eyes and said, "I don't want to miss any more moments." I nodded, knowing healing is messy and slow but possible. I still carried scars, the loss of my job, the betrayal, the loneliness of those early months. But now I carried hope. Hope that my son would know his worth isn't defined by the mistakes of others. Hope that he'd grow up seeing a mother who fought, not just for him, but for herself. One day, Kai Jr. will ask about his name. And when he does, I'll tell him everything, not just the pain, but the love, complicated, imperfect, and fiercely real, that made him who he is. Because in the end, it's not how a story begins, but how it's told. And I'm ready to tell ours with honesty, strength, and the voice I never lost. One afternoon, while Kai Jr. napped, I found myself scrolling through old photos on my phone. Pictures from before the pregnancy, candid moments with Kai at work events, blurry shots from company parties where we smiled but never spoke about what was happening beneath the surface. I realized how much of my life had been compartmentalized, hidden away in folders and memories I rarely revisited. Yet here was my son, asleep in the next room, a living reminder that those chapters weren't the end of my story. I texted Kai something simple: "Thank you for showing up." His reply came quickly: "Learning every day." For him, it wasn't much, but it meant everything. That small exchange felt like a fragile bridge, unsteady but real. I don't know where this path will lead us. Maybe someday we'll heal enough to call each other family again. Maybe not. But the weight of the past no longer drags me down. I carry it with me, sure, but it doesn't define me. Instead, I choose the moments I create now, the laughter, the quiet mornings, the bedtime stories weaving our own narrative. And for the first time, I feel free. Not because the CEO recognized his son, nor because my name was cleared, but because I found my voice. And that voice will never be silenced again. The last moment of closure came unexpectedly. One rainy afternoon, a package arrived at my door, no sender's name, just my address written in a familiar handwriting. Inside was a photo album filled with old, unseen pictures of Kai holding me during a company retreat, laughing with colleagues, and from the early days when we believed in something more. Along with it was a letter, brief and honest. "I can't change the past, but I want to be part of his future. Thank you for naming him Kai. It means more than you know." I sat on the floor with the album in my lap, rain tapping the windows, feeling a mix of sadness and peace. That was the last thread tying me to the man who once erased me. It wasn't an apology or a promise. It was a quiet acknowledgement. And for me, that was enough. I closed the album gently and looked over at Kai Jr., now playing with his blocks, his laughter filling the room. This story isn't about perfect endings or fairy tales. It's about survival, truth, and the messy, beautiful journey of reclaiming yourself. And as long as I have my voice and him, I know the future is ours to write, no matter what it holds.